Hi, I have had the best day and I'm going to dinner now. You guys remember when I was talking about the TV pitch I did a while ago?
What began as a seemingly golden opportunity quickly unraveled into a backstage cautionary tale, one that industry insiders are still whispering about in private. The crew initially tried to roll with Rachel Zegler's intensity, perhaps because her passion was undeniable or maybe because they wanted to believe she was just injecting some spark into a legendary role. But over time, the energy that had once looked like raw ambition started to feel less like inspiration and more like a hostage situation. On paper, the moment had all the makings of a dream. Here was a young actress cast in a role that defined entire generations, a role that had launched careers into the stratosphere, won Tony Awards, and inspired decades of performers. Rachel's name attached to Evita felt like lightning in a bottle. It was the chance for her to step out of the polished but narrow image of a Disney princess and the sardonic commentary that had become her social media calling card, and instead prove she could command a stage on her own terms. From the moment she walked into rehearsals, her presence was magnetic. People described it as the kind of moment where someone enters a room and suddenly everything else fades, the energy shifts, the hierarchy bends, and it becomes clear that all eyes must turn toward this single person. That was the effect Rachel had when she arrived. Her aura seemed to declare that she was not just another cast member but the sun around which everyone else would orbit. For a while, even the skeptics admitted it was intoxicating. The press framed her casting as bold and inspired, theatre blogs buzzed with excitement, and audiences were prepared to cheer for her as if she were a savior of modern theatre. This was her golden ticket, her chance to step out of the shadow of hype and finally cement herself as something more enduring. Yet behind the curtain, trouble began almost instantly. At first, cast and crew members tried to give her grace. After all, stars often come with big personalities, and a touch of ego can sometimes elevate a performance. But the small indulgences soon snowballed into a daily ordeal. Rachel began arriving late to rehearsals, keeping entire teams waiting while she made her entrance on her own time. Vocal coaches found their suggestions dismissed with a wave of her hand or a sarcastic remark, as if decades of expertise were trivial compared to her instinct. Choreography sessions became unpredictable battlegrounds. Mid-performance she would abruptly switch moves, throwing off the rhythm of fellow performers and leaving the dance captains scrambling to adapt. It wasn't just tinkering at the edges of the production. Rachel reportedly declared that Evita itself required nothing short of a full reinvention. She wanted to tear down the structure of the show and rebuild it around her vision, shifting the tone away from sweeping musical theatre spectacle and transforming it into something raw, stripped down, and intimate. To some, the ambition sounded daring. To others, it sounded like chaos. Insiders claimed she clashed openly with the director, arguing during blocking sessions and insisting on rewriting emotional beats of entire scenes. "This needs to reflect feminine rage," she reportedly said in one tense exchange, "and you don't understand evil the way I do." Her conviction was fierce, but it was also suffocating. Bold ideas can breathe new life into a role, but they can also poison the atmosphere when every rehearsal becomes a war zone. Soon the cast began to feel the pressure. Nobody dared correct her, disagree with her, or even breathe in a way she might interpret as resistance. The room became tense with silent calculations. Should they speak up and risk her wrath, or stay quiet and watch the production bend around her impulses? Even seasoned performers, veterans with decades of stage experience and walls of accolades, found themselves on the receiving end of her icy stares. According to one insider, Rachel had developed a habit of staring down anyone who questioned her, a look sharp enough to cut through the room, half passive-aggressive glare and half public humiliation. What might have been spirited debate in another environment quickly calcified into fear. The collateral damage didn't end with the performers. Stagehands began quietly rearranging their schedules to avoid working on her rehearsals, whispering to each other in the wings about who would have to endure her demands that day. One assistant choreographer confided to colleagues that Rachel was the most exhausting person they had ever worked with, and considering the high-stress world of live theatre, that was no small statement. Even the wardrobe department wasn't spared. Costumes that had been carefully designed and meticulously tailored had to be redone, not once or twice, but 5 separate times, because Rachel reportedly decided they failed to embody the elusive quality she called female power. Each redo meant wasted hours, strained tempers, and budgets stretched thinner than anyone wanted to admit. People close to the production described an atmosphere of exhaustion, as though every department was being drained of its creative energy and funneled into sustaining one person's relentless vision. What had started as Rachel's moment to prove she was more than hype was quickly becoming a reminder of how quickly promise can curdle into frustration. The role of Eva Peron was supposed to be the crowning jewel in her rise, the performance that cemented her as a serious artist and not just a fleeting celebrity. Instead, whispers circulated backstage and leaked beyond the theater's walls, painting a picture of a company not united in artistry but fractured by one actress's storm of demands. The line between passion and tyranny blurred, and for those trapped in the production with her, the excitement of a bold new Evita had turned into the quiet dread of surviving rehearsal after rehearsal. Then came what is now remembered as the infamous New Argentina breakdown, the moment that crystallized everything simmering beneath the surface. In the middle of what was supposed to be a full-out staging, Rachel reportedly stopped mid-song, threw her hands up in frustration, and declared, "I'm not doing the circus anymore." The music crashed to an awkward halt, the ensemble froze mid-movement, and the entire room fell into stunned silence as she stormed off the stage. For a few long beats, no one moved, no one breathed, until someone finally gave voice to what had been growing in everyone's mind for weeks: "She has to go." That was the turning point, the moment when private grumblings hardened into open rebellion, and from that point on, the atmosphere inside the company changed dramatically. No longer content to rely on whispered complaints and nervous side glances, a group of cast members began documenting everything in meticulous detail. They kept written records, noting dates, direct quotes, tantrums, and interruptions, building a paper trail that would leave no room for doubt. Some even resorted to discreetly recording brief excerpts of rehearsals, just in case Rachel's behavior escalated further, and, according to those present, it inevitably did. With a mountain of receipts in hand, they approached the producers not with rumors but with evidence. The formal complaint, reportedly signed by nearly half the cast, was blunt and damning, at one point reading, "Rehearsals have become unsafe, unproductive, and entirely centered around one person's emotional instability." It was the kind of statement that could not be ignored. And yet, astonishingly, the first round of complaints failed to spark immediate action. Frustration deepened, and the cast took things one step further. A small group, representing ensemble members, supporting roles, and even a weary vocal coach, marched directly into a closed-door meeting with the producers and made their position impossible to misinterpret. This was not a polite suggestion, it was an ultimatum. "We are not going back on stage with her," they said plainly. The producers, blindsided, reportedly looked at one another in disbelief, one of them even asking, "You're asking us to fire the lead?" The answer came swift and sharp: "No, we're telling you we won't work if you don't." That's not mutiny. That's a wake-up call. And in that instant, the balance of power shifted. Rachel vanished from rehearsals, her name conspicuously absent from the call sheet. Stand-ins quietly stepped into her scenes, and for the first time in weeks, rehearsals moved forward without confrontation or tension. The production team, relieved yet cautious, began the delicate task of reshaping the show around her absence, deliberately keeping everything quiet and drama-free. There were no press releases, no dramatic statements, not even a whisper of official explanation. Instead, the silence did the talking. Her dressing room, once buzzing with activity, was reportedly cleared out overnight, her belongings packed away as if she had never been there at all. What came next was a profound shift in atmosphere. Backstage, people described the feeling as though the air itself had been let back into the room. The heaviness lifted, the tension dissipated, and for the first time in months, the company could focus solely on the work. No more walking on eggshells, no more fear of public call-outs or explosive tantrums, just professionals doing their jobs with a sense of relief and renewed focus. One cast member later described it simply: "It felt like freedom." And though the producers scrambled to keep the truth contained behind closed doors, trying to keep the show's reputation intact, the story was already written in the whispers of those who lived it. The chapter of Rachel Zegler and Evita had ended not with applause but with an empty dressing room, a vanished name, and a production finally exhaling after months of suffocation. It turned into nothing short of full-scale crisis control, the kind of high-stakes, behind-the-scenes scramble that theatre veterans later recalled with a mix of disbelief and exhaustion, as if the production itself had been pulled to the edge of collapse and then forced into a desperate balancing act to keep from toppling over. The producers, now under immense pressure, began making frantic calls to Rachel's PR team, hoping that seasoned strategists could conjure up a narrative that might protect both her reputation and the multi-million-dollar investment already sunk into the show. Meetings stretched late into the night, whispered conversations filled the theatre's corridors, and people spoke in hushed tones about the situation as though acknowledging it too loudly might cause the entire project to shatter. Rachel's agency, equally alarmed, began floating increasingly desperate ideas. One of the strangest and most desperate proposals reportedly involved restructuring the show into a co-lead format, essentially splitting the role of Eva between Rachel and her understudy, a theatrical compromise so bizarre and impractical that even the suggestion was met with stunned silence before dissolving into incredulous laughter. The very idea of dividing Eva Perron, a role defined by singular presence and unbroken dominance, was unthinkable. The cast, by this point united in solidarity, flatly refused to entertain such compromises. Their stance was immovable. There would be no bargaining, no patchwork fixes, no halfway solutions. This wasn't about bruised egos or petty rivalries anymore. It had become a question of survival, of whether the production could move forward in a safe, productive environment, free of the volatility that had nearly consumed it. Instead of slowing down, rehearsals exploded into a new gear. Freed from the tension and unpredictability that had defined the previous weeks, the company threw themselves into the work with an energy that startled even the most jaded veterans. At the center of this transformation was a figure who, until then, had barely registered on anyone's radar outside of the production, a quiet, steady understudy whose name rarely appeared in gossip columns or press releases, but who had been silently, diligently preparing in the shadows. She had studied every beat, every line, every gesture, internalizing not just the mechanics of the role but the essence of Eva herself. She had absorbed direction with humility, practiced choreography with patience, and memorized blocking with the discipline of someone who understood that opportunity rarely announces itself before it arrives. And when the moment finally came, when the void left by Rachel needed filling, she stepped into the spotlight not with hesitation but with a certainty that stunned the entire room. She didn't just perform the role, she inhabited it, embodying Eva Perron with such raw precision and grounded authority that the cast and crew were left in awe. One stagehand described it as watching a shadow suddenly take shape and outshine the light, while a veteran chorus member admitted that in a single rehearsal, the understudy's presence carried more weight, authenticity, and power than anything they had seen from Rachel in weeks. What made her rise even more remarkable was the complete absence of ego. There were no tantrums, no arguments, no whispered power plays, only quiet dedication, humility, and a burning focus on the work itself. For the first time in months, rehearsals flowed with rhythm and ease. Choreography that had once felt like an endless tug-of-war now clicked into place effortlessly, harmonies that had been strained suddenly locked in as though the entire ensemble had been waiting for this shift, and scenes that once collapsed under tension began to sparkle with clarity. The atmosphere was transformed. Morale, which had been scraping the floor, soared to exhilarating heights. Actors who had been arriving drained and leaving defeated began showing up early, staying late, and pouring themselves into the production with a vigor that had been missing for far too long. What emerged wasn't just a replacement performer, it was a rebirth of the show itself, a collective rediscovery of why they had all come together in the first place. It was like the theater was alive again, one insider confessed, like the soul of the production had finally come back. And yet, while the backstage world experienced this renaissance, the outside world remained oblivious. Rachel's fanbase still clung to the carefully constructed image of her as the shining face of Evita, unaware that behind the curtain her presence had evaporated. To them, she was still the star, still the centerpiece, still the chosen one destined to carry Eva to new heights. But in reality, her image was already unraveling. Her once active Instagram account, which had been a steady stream of polished rehearsal selfies, dramatic black and white portraits, and cryptic captions about creative transformation and the fire of feminine energy, suddenly went silent. Entire posts disappeared overnight, likes slowed to a crawl, and comments from confused fans began to pile up with questions that received no answers. It was a digital blackout, abrupt and eerie, as though she had been swallowed by the very silence she once commanded. And that silence told its own story, louder than any official statement, more damning than any press release. Inside the theater, a new Eva had risen, the cast had found its freedom, and the production had been reborn. Outside, the world was only beginning to notice that the star they thought was leading the charge had, in truth, already vanished, leaving only an empty feed, an empty dressing room, and a legacy rewritten by the understudy who seized the moment when everything else fell apart. After the full-scale cast revolt forced Rachel to the sidelines, what followed was nothing short of a theatrical implosion spilling onto the digital stage. At first, there was only silence from the production itself. No press releases, no clarifications, no soothing corporate statement to contain the growing chaos. But in the age of social media, silence does not equal control. Silence is simply a vacuum waiting to be filled. And fill it the internet did. The first crack in the wall came through a TikTok video that appeared late one night, grainy, shot from someone's phone who had clearly been lingering around rehearsals. The video didn't even show Rachel's face, just fragments of a rehearsal room, voices half heard, tension thick in the air, but the narration that accompanied it was enough to light the match. "You can't gaslight an ensemble," the creator whispered, their words laced with disbelief and exhausted amusement. That line alone turned into a viral slogan, spreading like wildfire across theater Twitter, Broadway subreddits, and gossip accounts. Within hours, the video hit over 2 million views, with comments piling up in the tens of thousands. Some mocked, some celebrated, some simply gawked at the sheer spectacle of it all. One comment, liked so many times it floated to the very top, read brutally, "I'd pay triple to see literally anyone else." From there, the situation snowballed. Rachel, who once ruled Instagram with carefully curated grids of dramatic rehearsal selfies and captions about artistry and process, went silent. The posts stopped. Her stories vanished. Her profile, once alive with cryptic emojis and dramatic lighting, went dark almost overnight. That silence only fueled speculation. Theater gossip accounts, emboldened by the lack of official narrative, started hinting at the truth. Blurry rehearsal shots were posted with captions like, "Notice who's missing." Cryptic tweets appeared from ensemble members' friends, vague enough to avoid legal blowback but sharp enough for fans to decipher. Soon, #Zegler out was trending globally, not just in Broadway circles but across mainstream pop culture feeds. Twitter, rebranded as X, became a battlefield. Loyalists fought to defend her, insisting the cast was jealous, intimidated, or too threatened by the sheer force of her genius to handle working alongside her. But the overwhelming flood of responses leaned the other way, drawing connections between this implosion and long-documented red flags. Clips resurfaced from past interviews, stitched into new TikToks that painted a pattern of arrogance. One viral throwback, shared thousands of times, showed Rachel smirking into the camera during a behind-the-scenes moment, a cheap plastic crown on her head as she declared, "They'll hate me for this, too." The internet turned on her instantly, quote-tweeting the clip with captions like, "And she was right," or "Congratulations, you played yourself." What had once been an online army of supporters began to fracture in real time. Fan accounts that had hailed her as the future of theater started falling silent. Some quietly deactivated. Others pivoted, transforming overnight into tribute accounts for the understudy who had now stepped into the spotlight with grace and grit. Memes comparing the two spread like wildfire. Rachel was cast as the cautionary tale, the diva who flew too close to the sun, while the understudy became the symbol of everything Broadway romanticizes: hard work, humility, and talent rewarded at last. Eva without the tantrums, one meme read. Eva without the attitude, that's how you start a revolution. Even her most die-hard defenders couldn't keep the tide from turning, and their replies were drowned out by the sheer volume of ridicule, disappointment, and gleeful schadenfreude.
I guess you're wondering where I've been. Hi, everyone. I'm not back, but I just wanted...
Meanwhile, the official Evita social accounts adopted an eerily cautious tone. Where once Rachel's face dominated every post, her name tagged relentlessly in every caption, now there was nothing. No glossy stills of her in costume, no glowing rehearsal updates, no spotlight interviews. In their place were vague, blurred group photos, stripped of individual focus, and impersonal graphics announcing a new creative direction. It was obvious to anyone watching that the production was scrubbing her image from its narrative. The silence, the lack of acknowledgement, said more than any statement could. Insiders whispered that her dressing room had been quietly emptied, her costumes repurposed for the understudy, and her name erased from the call sheet as though she had never been there at all. To the outside world, the production offered only bland, sanitized content, but behind the curtain, the cast and crew felt something entirely different. One ensemble member would later say it best: "It was like the air finally came back into the room. No more walking on eggshells. No more fear. Just theater again." And online, the world was watching, dissecting every clue, every silence, every vanished post, as Rachel's once glittering image collapsed in real time. Fans assembled the puzzle pieces far more quickly than the show's creators ever expected. To the casual observer, it might have looked like Rachel was simply taking a short break, quietly stepping aside to recharge before storming back into the spotlight. But those who were paying attention, the bloggers, the industry insiders, the obsessive theater fans who live on TikTok and X, saw the truth immediately. Rachel wasn't taking a break, she wasn't renegotiating her role, she wasn't preparing some grand re-entry. She was gone. Backstage, her name wasn't spoken anymore, as if invoking it would jinx the fragile stability the company had finally regained. Her once busy dressing area, a hub of assistants and stylists and endless coffee cups, now stood eerily bare, stripped down to an empty mirror and a rack of clothes that had already been reassigned. It was as though she had been surgically cut out of the production, not just removed but erased. For a woman who once dominated every rehearsal, every headline, every online conversation, the sudden absence was louder than any performance she could have delivered. Industry insiders quickly began whispering about the transformation her absence had unleashed. With Rachel gone, the understudy, long overlooked, quietly rehearsing in the shadows, stepped forward and delivered something extraordinary. Her performance wasn't desperate or showy, it was controlled, precise, deeply felt. Powerful, magnetic, undeniable. One veteran director who attended a preview was reportedly floored, walking out of the theater muttering to colleagues, "This is what Eva Peron was meant to feel like. Not a diva clawing for attention, but a ghost haunting the stage, a presence bigger than herself." That remark spread like wildfire across the industry, repeated in hushed tones by agents, critics, and even rival producers. While Rachel's PR team scrambled behind the scenes to spin her absence into something palatable, drafting half-baked statements, floating rumors of creative differences, even brainstorming excuses about vocal strain, the show itself had already moved on. Previews were underway, the buzz was growing, and the energy backstage was rejuvenated. No one was waiting for Rachel anymore. The train had left the station, and she wasn't on it. The early chatter around those first previews only amplified the sense of momentum. Ensemble members spoke of the difference in the room, the tension had evaporated, rehearsals were focused again, and the company finally felt united. The relief was palpable. For weeks, every rehearsal had felt like a battlefield. Now, it felt like art again. And as critics and industry reporters began to catch wind of the changes, the story shifted from scandal to salvation. Evita has found its center, one insider whispered, and the comment ricocheted through the community like a sigh of relief. Meanwhile, Rachel remained conspicuously absent from every public-facing event. No red carpet appearances, no candid paparazzi shots, no quirky Instagram updates. For someone who had once made social media her stage, the blackout was glaring. In the theater world, such a disappearance doesn't suggest rest or reinvention, it suggests damage control, exhaustion, or worse, blacklisting. Everyone in the business understood what the silence meant. Rachel wasn't regrouping, she was being contained. The final nail came when the official Evita program quietly changed. There was no public announcement, no farewell note, no carefully worded explanation thanking Rachel for her contributions. Her name simply vanished. In its place was the understudies, now printed in bold, a silent confirmation that the torch had been passed. For Rachel, it was the harshest reality check of her young career. Theater does not forgive in the way Hollywood does. On Broadway, presence, respect, and rhythm are everything. You either fit into the ensemble, or you fracture it beyond repair. Hollywood, by contrast, is far more forgiving. There, an actor can deliver a public apology, hire a new stylist, rebrand their persona, and land a comeback role within 6 months. The machine of image making allows for reinvention. But theater is merciless. There are no retakes, no filters, no stylists to save you. You show up, you give everything, and you live or die by the way your colleagues respond to your presence. Rachel didn't just stumble, she bulldozed through rehearsals, shattered trust, and then tried to reframe the wreckage as brilliance. Her critics had warned for years that this was coming, that her ego was outpacing her craft. Now, their warnings had crystallized into prophecy. She hadn't merely lost a role, she had lost the room, the trust, the rhythm, and, perhaps most dangerously, the faith of an industry that had once called her the future sound snippets from the red carpet, the disorganized interviews, and the passive-aggressive tweets, always wrapped in the hollow sheen of supposed empowerment, once created an image that looked bold, modern, and even enviable to those watching from a distance. For a time, being youthful, boisterous, and self-aware seemed like enough to be considered a brand in itself, a kind of performance that thrived in the current media climate where personality often overshadows craft. Social media amplified every pose and every soundbite, and for a while, the illusion worked. But the stage is not a feed, and theater is not a platform where style can permanently substitute for substance. Unlike the fast-moving churn of online attention, theater has always demanded a slower, deeper form of commitment. It requires humility to stand in service of a story bigger than any one performer, discipline to refine one's role day after day in rehearsal, and a kind of teamwork that asks every individual to step forward and step back in equal measure. These are values built into the fabric of live performance, and when they are ignored, no amount of charisma can fill the void. Those close to the production quietly suggest she is still working behind the scenes to repair the damage, attempting to mend relationships and salvage her reputation before it hardens into something unshakable. Yet even in these accounts, the same refrain echoes. The cast never asked her to dim her personality or silence her perspective. They simply asked her to contribute as a teammate, to weave her voice into the larger chorus rather than insisting on a solo at every turn. That is the unspoken contract of ensemble work, and it is one she either could not or would not uphold. Her team attempted to frame the departure with the language of creative burnout, painting it as a temporary step back for the sake of mental health and long-term artistry. Others tried to soften the story by claiming she left willingly for personal growth, but those narratives collapsed almost immediately under the weight of what insiders revealed. Few found the official explanations believable when it became known that half the ensemble had signed an agreement to see her removed, that entire sequences had to be reblocked and restaged at considerable cost, and that her replacement was ushered in with unusual precautions, shielded almost protectively from outside scrutiny as though the production feared another rupture. The reaction among her fans tells its own story. A loyal but shrinking core clings to conspiracy theories, insisting she was punished for being too strong-willed, too visionary, or too unwilling to conform to industry expectations. They see her exit not as a failure but as proof that the system cannot handle a woman who refuses to play by the rules. Yet the majority of her audience, once quick to leap to her defense, has grown weary. They have spent too long justifying chaos, explaining away every rumor, every incident, every whisper of dysfunction. Their energy has thinned, and the fandom spaces that once glowed with admiration now feel tired, their activity slowing to a trickle. Even fan edits, once a flood of creativity celebrating her every expression, now appear rarely, as though the well of inspiration itself has dried up. What lingers is not excitement but fatigue, not devotion but disillusionment. In the broader industry, the implications are hard to ignore. Theater, particularly when it comes to legacy productions, functions on trust. Trust that the cast can support one another, trust that the creative vision will not be hijacked, trust that tradition can coexist with innovation without either being destroyed. When a performer treats such a production like a personal pet project, rewriting the rules to suit their own impulses, the backlash is swift and unforgiving. The sparkle that once made her seem untouchable has dimmed, leaving not the portrait of a misunderstood genius but that of someone who underestimated the weight of the stage she stood on. Legacy productions are not playgrounds for experimentation at the expense of others. They are inherited responsibilities, passed down like heirlooms, and to mishandle them is to insult the generations of artists who built them. For now, her name is absent from official materials, her presence scrubbed quietly from promotional cycles. There is no spotlight, no triumphant return to center stage, only whispers of rehearsal footage and murmured stories shared in theater circles like cautionary tales. In private conversations, her story is already being used as an example of what happens when branding overtakes craft, when the desire for attention outweighs the duty to collaborate. The industry is patient in some ways, always ready for a comeback if the lesson is learned, but it is rarely forgiving when arrogance undermines the collective effort. What remains is a silence that feels heavier than any headline, a pause in which the once vibrant noise of her persona has faded. Whether that silence becomes the space for reflection and rebuilding, or whether it hardens into the permanent quiet of a career cut short, depends not on conspiracy theories or fan devotion, but on whether she can finally understand that in theater, the story is always bigger than the star. It appears that she is electric, charismatic, grounded, and razor-sharp with her lines, a performer whose sheer presence can command attention and lift a scene into something unforgettable. The crew has described her as a natural leader, someone who seemed to carry an almost magnetic influence without needing to dominate with ego or arrogance, and at her best moments she seemed to hold the fragile production together when it threatened to unravel. Some even go so far as to say she saved the show from implosion in its early stages, stepping in with the energy and decisiveness that gave the company momentum. And yet, for all the dazzling skill and stagecraft, the silence around her now is deafening. Not one member of the cast has defended her publicly. Not a single former co-star has written a word of praise about her professionalism. No fellow actor has taken to Twitter, Instagram, or any other platform to show support, and in an industry where public solidarity is often instantaneous, that lack of defense feels telling. The PR machine, once a carefully oiled mechanism designed to protect and uplift her name, has ground to a halt, and in this world, silence is never an accident. It is a choice, a deliberate message meant to isolate, to distance, to make clear that the industry has decided to move on. Rumors naturally fill the vacuum where official statements fail. Whispers suggest that she has already moved on to a new project, perhaps a low-budget independent film or a mid-tier streaming series where the risk is lower and the glare of mainstream attention less punishing. But whether studios will be willing to gamble on her again is another matter entirely. The fallout from Evita has grown far beyond the scale of an ordinary scandal. It is not the kind of misstep that can be brushed away with a rebranding campaign or buried under a new role. Instead, it has become a cautionary tale. Her name, once linked with the promise of new talent, sharp instincts, and a forceful artistic presence, now conjures words like conflict, disruption, and instability. Directors, no matter how daring in their artistic visions, do not want unnecessary headlines attached to their productions. They crave harmony, reliability, and a cast they can trust to elevate the story rather than fracture it. Rachel has shown, through one too many incidents, that she cannot yet guarantee that. The tragedy of it all is how close she came to something extraordinary. She had the audience's attention in her hands, waiting to be won over fully, waiting to be transported. And then, rather than channeling her talent into consistency and connection, she allowed her ego to overshadow her craft. She stormed offstage mid-song, leaving the company and the audience in shock. She lashed out at critics and detractors, demanding loyalty instead of earning respect. The theater has its own laws, laws that reward reliability, timeliness, and generosity of spirit. The applause is not given for sheer volume or bravado, but for discipline, for the steady hand that never falters no matter the chaos around it. She broke that unspoken pact, mistaking spectacle for respect, mistaking defiance for artistry. In doing so, she burned through the goodwill that had once surrounded her. What has emerged in her absence is telling. The atmosphere backstage, once heavy with tension and dread, has transformed. Crew members who once dragged their feet into rehearsals now show up early, linger late, and even laugh together in a way they had not for months. The cast has rediscovered its rhythm, the sense of ensemble unity that makes theatre thrive. The director has even gone on record to describe the current version of Evita as the most collaborative production of my career, a remark that speaks volumes about just how disruptive her presence had become. Where chaos once reigned, there is now cohesion, a harmony that proves the show was never the problem, the dynamic was. And the one person missing from that harmony is Rachel, the same Rachel who once tweeted with confidence and defiance, "This role will change me." Perhaps she was right, though not in the way she envisioned. The role did change her, but instead of elevating her to the pantheon of stage legends, it exposed the cracks in her approach. She had the tools, talent, charisma, presence, but she never learned how to use them without setting fire to the room around her. Now she lingers in conversations not as the shining star who was about to redefine a classic, but as the example industry insiders point to when they warn about the dangers of unchecked ego. Her story is spreading faster than her skill ever could, because reputation in this business is a currency more powerful than raw ability. She became the headline no one wanted to click on, the scandal people reference in hushed tones, the cautionary figure who proves that in theatre, brilliance means nothing without discipline. And this shadow will not fade quickly. Even if her team manages to secure another project, even if a small film or series takes her on, the memory of Evita will linger, attached to her name like an unshakable echo. Audiences may still admire her raw talent, but directors and producers, those who hold the power to hire, will remember the risks, the cost, the instability. In a world where reputation spreads faster than skill, Rachel Zegler has become a parable, a reminder that the stage rewards those who give themselves to it fully, not those who demand that the spotlight bend to them. She could have soared, she could have redefined a role for a new generation, but instead she stumbled, and the fall was loud enough that it will echo for years to come.